Hello my Flutter friends. Today we're going to be digging into a beginner tutorial on Riverpod. This is targeted towards people who likely haven't used Riverpod before, or maybe haven't used it since the generators were introduced a little while ago, or someone who just wants to brush up on stuff. But it's definitely meant for beginners and meant for people that maybe haven't even used state management before and have just been using things like set state in their apps. So Riverpod is something I use on a lot of projects. Although I've used things like Block and Signals and done videos on them even, I always come back to this project. I think it's really great, and it just works with my mindset at least. I'm not saying it's the best thing in the world. Everyone has their opinion. There's always a battle about state management. And in fact, if we look at the Flutter docs on it, there's a lot of options here. Things like provider, setting state, June is a relatively new one, Redux, if you're coming from sort of the React world, obviously Block, Get It, although I see that more as a service locator than, a state management package, etc., etc. Lots of options out there. And we're going to be focusing on one specifically, and it's called Riverpod. But first, let's just talk about its history a little bit. It was created by, and is still actively being created by, Remy here. I have his GitHub profile. He's created quite a few really good projects for Flutter, and this is, his state management project. Now you'll see in here he also was the creator of Provider, and if you do a little bit of research and kind of look at the name of Riverpod, you'll actually find out that Riverpod is an anagram of Provider. They have the same letters in it, so I believe he just took this name and rearranged the letters to make something cool. And a post I saw on Reddit once that I thought was pretty funny is the developer of Riverpod was the prior dev of Provider, also another anagram. Enough fun facts for one day. What are we going to be building? Well, we're going to be building a really basic example app, but it's not a to-do app because everyone does to-do apps. I want to do something, in some ways very similar to to-do app, but we're going to be listing a whole bunch of colors, and we're going to be using an API for this because a lot of the times with state management, you're dealing with network requests and stuff. Now, what this tutorial isn't, we're not going to be talking about things like clean architecture or, building an entire app and all the pieces and stuff like that. We're really just going to focus on some examples that show Riverpod. Now, if there's a lot of good feedback on this video, I'd be happy to do a complete clean architecture video using Riverpod because I have built apps using that approach before. So let me know in the comments if that's something you would find useful. And this is a great time to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching. Let's get into it now. So I have a completely empty Flutter project here. We're just going to call it Riverpod tutorial. And the first thing we're going to do is actually install some packages here. So I'll make this a little bit bigger, especially in the command line to be able to see things here. So the first thing we're going to install is actually Flutter Riverpod. We could, of course, install just Riverpod, but Flutter Riverpod is what we really want because we want all the stuff, not just the Dart stuff, but also the Flutter side of things. And by installing this, it already depends on the Riverpod package itself, so we'll get access to that. So we're just going to install that. Another thing we're going to need later is Riverpod annotation, and this allows us to do things like code generators and whatnot to make our life a little bit easier. Then there's some dev dependencies we're going to want. Now, this is really only required if you are using the generators, which we'll get into at the end of this video, but we'll install it now anyways. So we're going to install by denoting with dev : Riverpod generator. We're also going to do the same and install build _ runner. We're going to install also custom lint, which is a way we can actually get some custom linting that Riverpod provides. And in order to get that custom linting, we have to install Riverpod lint. And if we open up our pubspec.yaml, we will see these lovely things installed for us. So you'll see we have Riverpod, Flutter Riverpod, and Riverpod annotation in our dependencies, and then all of those dev dependencies here that we just put in. One more thing I just want to install, and although this is not a requirement for Riverpod, we are going to be making some HTTP requests. So we're going to do flutter pub add dio, just my go-to network manager in order to talk to the internet. Okay, great. So we have those things set up and good to go. The last part of the setup of a Riverpod project is we need to go to our main.dart. And we're going to actually wrap this in a provider scope. Now, before we do that, actually, I just want to get the custom linter set up because we'll actually see a cool warning here once we have that. So all we have to do, because we've installed that, is go to our analysisoptions.yaml. And right at the bottom, so not within linter, but sort of its separate place, inside analyzer, we're going to add plugins custom lint, and that's that package that we installed. Now, as soon as we do that, if we at least wait a minute, we should start to see a warning here. And here it is right here. It's telling us that it should have a provider scope widget at the top of the widget tree. So we can, of course, just wrap this if we want, but this will give us a little bit of help. If we eventually scroll to the bottom and go to quick fix, we can add the provider scope. Now we do have to import that, so we'll just do a little control space to get that from the Flutter Riverpod package. And we're just going to add a const here to just make everything really clean and nice. All right, the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to organize this a little bit. We're going to make a source folder, and inside the source folder, we're going to start by making a services directory. And inside here, I'm going to just make something called API service.dart. So we just have to get a little bit out of the way here in order to, essentially work with some real data. We're just going to build a simple, kind of a mock service that is going to return us colors. And we're also going to want to have a model to represent this color. Now I'm going to call this color result, only because we don't really want to use the word color because that's already used in material, and we'll have a lot of annoying conflicts that we'll have to deal with. So we're going to call this color result. All right, so this is how I foresee our color result. Each color will have an ID. It'll have a title, a username of who created the color, the number of views, the hex code itself, and whether or not it's been liked, because we're going to have a little bit of, sort of like favoriting in this to show off a couple other things. Now we'll have a constructor for this that basically requires us to pass all these in, although isLiked will be just false by default. Then we'll just create a to.json back from our API here. So we're just passing in JSON here and we're returning this. And the hex code, we're actually going to put just a number sign in front of it. So it kind of feels like a real hex code because our API doesn't send that back. Lastly, I just want a sort of a helper function here that will take whatever the hex code is and actually return it into a color. So this is some basic code that makes sure that this has been erased again. It adds the FF in front of it if it's 6 in length, and then it does a parse on it to actually create the material color based on that. So we have a simple color model. Now in our API service, we're going to want something to list the top colors. And I'll just point out where this is all coming from. So we're going to be using this service called colorlovers.com that has an API. And it's a pretty basic API. It is an XML-based API, but I found out you could pass format equals JSON into it to get it back in JSON. So there's an endpoint for getting the top colors. There's also one to retrieve it, et cetera, and we'll see that in a minute here. So we'll make a function. It's going to return a list of these color results of our model. And we'll start by using do to basically hit that endpoint. So API/color/top format JSON. We're going to cast the results, the response.data to a list of dynamic. Then we're going to take all the results and map through them and use our lovely color result from JSON here to actually build a list and ultimately return a list of color results. Similarly, we're going to want a retrieve function here. So our retrieve, we'll be passing in just a hex code here, and we'll want to make sure that that number sign gets removed. And we're going to go and hit the colorlover/API/color, not colors, and then the ID and format JSON again. So we get back in JSON and do the same kind of thing, except we don't have to map here. We're just returning a single color result. However, we might be getting null back, so we are allowing this to be nullable in case someone passes in a hex code that is not possible. So there's our basic service and our basic model. Not really Riverpod specific, so I went through it really quick here. Okay, let's get into actually working with a notifier now. So we'll make a new folder here. I'll call it providers. And we're going to make something, and it'll be color list provider.dart. All right, in here, we are going to create a class just called colorList. It's going to extend Notifier, which is part of our Riverpod package here. And we need to denote what type of data is going to be stored in this generic here. It's going to be a list of color results. Then we must create a build function that's actually overriding something in our notifier class. This is essentially what gets called when this notifier is first requested, and we need to return what would come back at first. And because we're returning a list and we have to do something async, we're just going to return an empty list at this point. Next, let's create a private load function that will work with our API service. So we'll denote it to be future void. It's not actually going to return anything because it's going to operate the state directly. In here, we're just going to get results by hitting our API service and hitting that function list top colors that we made previously. And now all we have to do is say state is going to be equal to results. And just doing the state equals, if you're coming from something like provider, this will also notify the listeners here when anytime this state changes. Now, what's important to notice is that we cannot simply modify state. We can't say like state.add all and then pass in the results. If we did that, we wouldn't actually notify listeners. We always have to completely replace whatever it is. Next, we'll make sure this load function gets called when this is bootstrapped. So it's going to load, it's going to do something. It's still going to return because we're not awaiting for this load. That would be a problem if we were waiting. We're just kind of triggering it to go so that there's always data and we don't have to have like a user interaction to actually put that in. Then let's make a refresh function because we might want to pull down to refresh. And simply, this is just going to set state to empty, so just an empty list, and then we're going to await the load happening. Finally, we do need to make a reference to this essentially singleton here, and we're just going to call it colorListProvider, and it's going to be equaling a NotifierProvider. It's not a notifier, but a NotifierProvider. We pass in the name of the provider, colorList, and then we have to make sure these match, so we take this and put it here, and then we have to put in our build function colorList.new, which is just a automatic factory that's going to exist based on the notifier class. Let's save that. All right, let's get to the UI layer and see how we can work with this. We're going to go to our main.dart, and we are just going to clean it up a bit, get rid of some comments, get rid of the built-in example, and we're just going to put something here called home screen, which doesn't exist yet, but let's make it. So in source, I'm just going to make a new folder called screens. Inside screens, we're going to make something called home screen.dart, and we'll make just a stateless widget called home screen. Go back here and make sure that gets imported in, and we are looking good. Let's return a scaffold here, and we can give it an app bar just for fun, title, text, Riverpod tutorial, and we're going to have to give it a body, which we'll get to very shortly. We'll just put a little temporary text here, hello world, and I've started up our app here, and we have this lovely app. So what we're going to do now is, because we want to be working with state, we need to include a consumer here. So we can actually just wrap this in a normal builder and change this to consumer, which will import from Flutter Riverpod. Then we have to update the parameters here. The first one's still going to be context, then ref, and then child. However, we won't be making use of this, so we can just use an underscore to make things easy. All right, and what is ref? So ref is kind of our way to access the state, to watch changes on the state, and all those kinds of things. So as soon as we have this wrapped here, we can actually make use of the ref. So first of all, let's get our list of colors. So we can go final colors equal ref.watch, and we will just pass in our color list provider that we created earlier. And this will have, as you see, a list of colors here. So let's just work with this, and let's start by going, if colors are empty, so if colors.isEmpty, we'll just return a center with a child of a circular progress indicator. Now, this isn't necessarily the best practice in a real app because, just because it's empty doesn't mean it's loading. But for our cases, when it's empty, we can expect that it is loading because it's going to start empty, this is going to call, and then it's going to update. So just an example, we'll just use that. Then let's actually return a list view dot builder, assuming we have results. And our item builder, we'll just have our context and our index. We'll get access to the specific color just by going colors at that exact index. And then we might return, a list style. And for now, let's just have a title of color dot, we'll use the title. And of course, we need a widget here, so we'll wrap it in text and go like this. So we just have a builder that's going to go through all these. Now we do need to have an item count, or this will eventually create an issue. So let's just use our colors.length. All right, so let's refresh this, and we see all of our colors coming in here. So if we, and I'll just make this a little bit smaller here so we can kind of see both things at the same time. So if I actually do just a rebuild here, we should see that circular progress indicator making the call, and then we get our data in here. So that was pretty good, pretty simple. Now let's make this just a little bit nicer. So I'm going to actually wrap this in a widget card just to make it, kind of have this nice little elevation here. We can also do some things like we could create a leading right here because we actually have access to the color. So let's do leading of a container. And we'll just give it the color of our color.color. And that's kind of a funny name, but that's because we just made this function here that is a getter, a property of this. So based on the hex code, we can actually get a material color back. And let's give this a width of maybe 32 and a height of 32. So now we should actually see these lovely boxes here, and everything is great. All right. We wanted to let our users refresh. We can wrap this in another widget called a refresh indicator. Okay, we'll wrap in this, and this requires an on refresh, which we're going to make an async function and do something here. Now, a good practice I like to do is anytime we need to actually access something in our provider, we might have our state here, but right before this, we might have something called provider equals ref dot, now in this case, read, and I'll explain that in a minute. Color list provider dot notifier. So what this is a reference to, this isn't a reference to the data itself. This is a reference to actually the color list right here. And the reason we're not watching it is because it would be a waste of resources. The actual provider class itself will never actually change or be replaced. It's only the data within it. So we use ref.read just to have access to it without watching for changes. And we specifically have to say .notifier. Otherwise, we're getting access to the state itself. So what we can do now with this provider here is we can go provider.refresh. And if we look at this function right here, we see we made this .refresh, cool, and this is just going to set the state and then reload everything. So let's test that out. And we pull this down and we'll see it kind of goes like this and everything's great. So we have our little refresh function, everything's cool. However, maybe there's some more functionality we want here, like the ability to favorite something. So we're going to set this up now in our provider. We are going to have a void function. It's not even a feature because it's not making a network call. Now, in the case that your API service wants you to make an API call to actually like it on the server and save in the database, this would be a feature likely, but we're just going to be doing it in memory. And with this, we need to pass in an ID of the actual color we want to do. And we're going to also use this to allow you to like and unlike. So we're also going to have a bool of, I'll just call it value. Okay. So based on this ID, we want to find out what index it is in that list. And we can simply do that by going final index equals state.indexWhere. And here we have to just put in our check function. So let's just call this color, and we want to say color.id is equal to the ID we're passing in. Okay. Now this will always return an integer. In the case that it doesn't find anything, the integer will be -1. So what we want to check is if index is greater or equal to 0, because 0 is actually a valid index, it could be the first one, then we actually want to do our operation. And what we can do here is we can say state is equal to, and what we'll do is we'll spread the state out so it's a new instance of it. We'll use this double dot dot, and we want to remove at whatever index we found it at, and then we actually want to insert a new version of it. And here we are going to insert the state at that index, and then we have to do something to it. Now, in order to modify this, the pattern that I actually like is we're going to go to our color result here. We could just use a copy with, and if we created a copy with thing, we would just basically do a copy with and say is like true. But most of this data to me is immutable. It's only is like. So we're actually going to create just a simple factory that will essentially be like a copy with, but only be meant for liking. So let's, sorry, not a factory, but it's going to essentially return a new version of a color result. So it'll be color result, and we'll just call it like, and we'll be able to pass in a value, which will be Boolean. And here we're going to return color result. And this will automatically put all the things in. We want to use the ID that is right now, the title is right now. However, for is liked, we're going to pass in that value. So this will actually, not just modify, because we don't want to modify this. This is all final stuff. We want to return a new instance of color result that copies everything over, except makes this one possible change here based on this. So now what we can do here is actually go state.like and just forward that value in that we had here. So that will make it either true or false and return a new one. So you'll see we're taking the state, we're replacing it with kind of like a copy of state and making some changes to it. And this will just make sure that the notify listeners happen. If we were just to modify the state itself, we wouldn't actually see a change happen. So let's save that right now, and let's go back to our home screen. And let's put a trailing here. And this will be an icon button. And we'll do our onPressed event, which we'll get to. And for its child, for its icon, it's going to be an icon. But the icon itself will be dependent on whether the color is liked or not. So we'll do color.isLiked, and we'll just do icons.favorite. In the case that it isn't liked, we'll do icons.favorite border. All right, and let's just see what that kind of looks like. So we see all these, none of them are liked at this time. So how do we like it? Well, we can use that same provider right here that we had, and we can just say provider.like, and we want to pass in an ID, so we have to use the color.id so it knows which one to find. And then the value, we're going to take color.like.isLiked, but we want to negate it. We want to make the opposite so that it always toggles. So let's just save that, and let's try clicking this button now, and we'll see they become liked. Now, none of this is storing to local storage or even storing to the database or anything. So if we do a full refresh, we will lose that data, but that's not a problem because this is really just like an example here to be able to show how Riverpod works. All right, so we have our liking and unliking, and everything is good there. Okay, so we've talked about our notifier provider right here. Notifier provider. Let's look at a different type of provider that's very common. We're going to make a color detail provider. And this won't be having a state of multiple things. This will really just be one color here. So to get this set up, we're going to start by making a final color detail provider. We'll just make this better. There we go. And it's going to be a future provider because it's going to return something in the future. It won't necessarily be in memory yet. So let's import that. And for our future provider, we need to say what will be returned. And in this case, it's going to be a color result. But again, could be null because it might not actually find one based on something. Okay, and then in here, we now have our ref access right here. And what we want to do is return, and we're going to return await. Which means we have to make this async. We want to use our API service dot retrieve, and here we need a hex code. And for now, we're just going to pass in 0000000 to kind of get black back. We will make this better shortly. Don't worry. Okay, so we have our color detail provider. So let's actually make a new screen called detail screen.dirt. And here we'll just make a simple stateless widget. We'll call it detail screen. Now we did in the previous UI, if we look at the home screen again, and let's actually just close everything, save everything, close everything so we're more organized. And here's our home screen. We essentially used a consumer builder here, which is a good practice to use, especially when your entire screen, there might be some parts that are not going to change based on state, and there might be some that are. So this is a good practice, but sometimes, and in the case for this, a detail screen, we want the whole component to essentially be a consumer. So we can actually use the consumer widget. And what this does is we actually have a second property we have to put in here called widget ref. And now we actually will have access to ref right here without having to wrap this in a builder. And what's kind of interesting is if you actually look at what a consumer builder is, if I can find it, we can click through to it. You actually see it actually just really returns a consumer widget that has using this builder operation. So we are, essentially using a consumer widget under the hood anyways here. But yeah, let's do it this way just to kind of see a different way of doing things. Okay, so on our detail screen, we want to get access to our specific color. And for now, it will always be black, just for this purpose. And then I'll show you how we can actually make it dynamic based on what screen you're on. So we're going to get access to it, and we're going to just call this result. And what we want to do is use ref.watch again, and we're going to watch our color detail provider. Okay, now this will not just be a color, it's actually an async value of color result, and that's because it's returning a future. It's not necessarily going to have data the second you get here. It needs to make an API call, there could be an error, all these kinds of things could happen. So what we're going to do is we are going to start by, we'll return a scaffold either way, and we're going to have an app bar, just so we can have a back button really. I'm not even going to put anything in it. And then our body, what we're going to do is we're going to take the result dot when. And here we have the three different cases: when we have data, when we have an error, and when we have loading. So for data, it's a function, and we need to put a parameter in here, and this will be the color that comes back. And you'll see this is a color result, could be null, so we'll have to handle that. For error, we actually have two parameters. The first one will be the error itself, and the second will be a stack trace, which I'll just do st. And we'll want to maybe do something with that data. Loading doesn't have any parameters, it's just loading. So for this, we can very easily just do a quick, simple circular progress indicator, and maybe we'll wrap it in a center. Let's just add some trailing comments here, and we'll deal with these ones now. Let's get rid of that. Now, to be honest, this is a good place to probably use the consumer, because that way, this is the only thing that, this will be the only part that gets rebuilt when something changes here. But again, I just wanted to show you, a different option of doing this when it's the right thing. So actually, let's get error out of the way. In the case that there's an error, let's just return text with the error.toString, and we will also wrap it in a center. Okay, so for color, this could be null. So let's first of all check if color equals null. Let's just return text saying not found, and similarly we'll wrap it in a center to make it really pretty. Otherwise, this is where we're going to return, the real good stuff here. Now, I'm just going to paste this one in because it's nothing to do with Riverpod really. We're just going to get access to that color and do some really nice, really nice UI. We're basically going to have a center with a column, and we're going to have the title of it, the username who created it, the number of views this color has, and just a nice little container like we did before that is a bit bigger than this one and circular. So let's save that, and then all we have to do is on our home screen, we want to add an onPressed event to the list tile itself. So let's just do that. And here we're going to go navigator.ofContext.push. Again, in a big project, I would be using something like Go Router for sure, but this is fine. For our builder, we just do this, and what we want to ultimately return is our detail screen, right? Detail screen, just like that. And we'll just add a couple commas to make this a little more readable. All right, so now, in theory, if I click one of these, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to load this screen. We're going to start watching this color detail provider. That's going to make the call. This will go from a state of loading to hopefully, a success, there being data, but possibly there could be an error if we made a mistake. Let's test it out. So I'll click this, and here we go. Now, like I said, we're always going to get black because we have that hard-coded right now. But this is working. And what's kind of interesting is if you notice, it's very quick, right? Now, let me load this again just to show you. The first time we click on it, you're going to see there's a bit of a spinner. The second time, though, it's instantly there. It's already in memory. And that's something cool about future providers. Unless you dispose them or invalidate the data, it is going to just still be in memory and ready for you to use, which is super handy. Okay, so let's actually make this dynamic. So in our color detail provider, we're going to look at a variant of FutureProvider. It's called FutureProvider.family. And even notifiers can have families too. And a family is kind of like a way that you can have multiple instances of a provider based on a certain value that all keep their own sort of like namespace. So as soon as we add a family, we start to see some errors because we have to tell Riverpod, okay, what is the type of the value that's going to be denoting the differences between this. And because hex is being passed in, we're going to use a string. Secondly, we need to actually, when we have a family, we actually have a second option here. So we're just going to call this hex code because that's what's going to get passed in when we create these. And now, instead of retrieving this in a hard-coded way, we can actually pass in that hex code. So I'm going to save that. Now we do have an error over here because this is saying, hey, like, I need more data. And because it's a family, we actually go color detail provider, open and closing parentheses here, and here we actually pass in a code. So that means we actually need to pass that into this widget. So we'll just make something called hex code. We'll make it a string, make it required, this.hex code, and then we can simply pass that in here. We'll save that. Now we have another error in our home screen because our detail screen is requiring a hex code to be passed in, and we can just go color.hex code and everything is great. Okay, let's just do a refresh to make sure everything is good. And now let's click black again because we love this color, and look, we got black back as expected. But let's go to another color, and now we're actually getting the ones that we expect. White, a little hard to see on the screen, but it's there. And you'll see if we click again, same kind of thing. All of these stayed in memory. Everything is good. Okay, the next thing I want to show is how we can make our Riverpod code a little bit cleaner using generators. We've already installed these packages, and we'll see down here we have Riverpod generator as well as the build runner. You need both of those in order for this next step to work. So let's close everything and let's start with the list provider. Okay, so what we're actually going to do here is we are going to go Riverpod like this, and we're actually going to use the uppercase version of the annotation so that we can pass in something called keep alive. This is something you may or may not want to do depending on what you're trying to accomplish, but doing this keep alive will mean that even when you leave that screen, that data is still going to be in memory, that this provider is still going to exist as long as it's been instantiated, or unless you like completely dispose it manually. Now, as soon as we have this, what we need to do is instead of actually extending notifier, we're going to extend something where we take whatever the name of this is, color list, and prefix it with an underscore and a $sign, color list here. Then we're actually going to get rid of this down here because this is actually going to get generated for us. So we'll save this file. Now you have to run the build runner function. I have a nice little plugin so I don't have to remember what to type. And if we see this load, I'm actually going to click this one right here, which will actually watch. So it's running Flutter pub run, build runner watch, delete collecting outputs. So I just have this watching so that when we make changes, everything is good. So it's still generating, but in a moment we should see this working. And I realize we missed one important part of it is because the generated code will be going into a separate file, we need to say that this is going to be part of a separate file. So we take part color list provider.g.dart, and we'll save that again. And now everything gets cleaned up. And you can see we can actually get rid of Riverpod because we're using Riverpod annotation. It's automatically including the Flutter Riverpod for us. So although in this example, it doesn't make that much of a difference here, there are a lot of really good advantages to using the generators. The biggest one, in my opinion, is when we're doing families. You can actually have multiple arguments for a family, and doing that without a generator is a lot of tedious code. And maybe if we have time, we'll see what I mean by that. Okay, so we've done that, and let's just see if we have any errors. Doesn't look like it. So everything kind of worked the same. Let's just refresh. And we're good. Okay, so that's just our simple generator for a notifier. Didn't make that much of a difference, but like I said, it's definitely worth using them as your project grows, in my opinion. Okay, our color detail provider is right here. So let's do the same kind of thing. Now this one is a pretty cool way of doing things. What we actually do here is we're going to create just a function. We're going to do what it returns. So we're going to have a future of color result, which could be null because it might be a 404 error. And we're just going to call it color detail. So not color detail provider, but color detail. And here we're going to pass in something where we take whatever the name of this is. However, we have to convert it to Pascal case, color detail, and then the word ref. And then, because this is a family, we actually pass in a second parameter, and we'll just call this hex code like we did before. Make it async, and we return the exact same thing here. Then we'll mark it with Riverpod, and we'll use that keep alive too, so we get that sort of caching, you know, once it's been fetched. I'm going to remove all of this. We're going to do our little part of color detail provider.g.dart. And now this should be pretty quick because I'm already watching for changes. It's only going to react to new ones. So you saw that was actually pretty quick. And we'll just get rid of that import. And we'll see what got generated in this. It created this, all this code here that just makes stuff really efficient and great. I'm not going to go through it. I don't understand all of it. I haven't looked at it that much to know. But now we have this generator. And to me, this is actually, you know, a bit simpler. You know, it's just like this function now. Now, how do we work with it? Well, we actually work with it the exact same way, and you'll see that there's no problem here. Our color detail provider, although that you'll see this links now to the generated code, we can then click one more time to see it's linking to this ultimately. So yeah, now we have our detail provider and everything is great. And let's just make sure everything's still working. Click on hot pink, cool. And if we click it again, it's gonna be really fast. All right. At least one more thing I want to show here is what I like to call a computed provider. That's not really the term. That's not really the real name for it. I don't know if there is a real name for it. I borrowed this name from the Signals package. They call it a computer provider. And it's the idea of a provider that's essentially relying on another provider, but maybe doing something to the data. So let's create that. We're going to create something, and we're going to call this the favorite colors provider.dart. And this will be a provider that doesn't really manage its own state. It just relies on other states. So we're just going to call it, favorite colors provider. And here we're going to extend just something very basic called provider. So we'll just take our provider there. And we have to still say what type of data we'll be getting back. It'll be a list of color results. And in here, we just simply pass our ref. And what we actually want to return here is we're going to do a ref.watch. So kind of like what we're doing in the UI side, right? Watching something. So we're going to watch the color list provider, but we're going to take that data and we're going to say where, and we'll just call this color. We want to say color.isLiked, and then convert it back to a list after. Okay, so now we have this cool thing called favorite colors provider. So let's make a screen to see that. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to our home screen. And I'm just going to copy this whole thing because it's going to be pretty similar. Again, not the best architecture to be copying and pasting when you have duplications. You know, you want to be looking for ways, but that is not in the scope of here. And let's just call this favorites screen.dart. And we'll just rename this favorites screen. And a couple changes I want to make here. For instance, if colors are empty, we don't want to use a loader anymore. Instead, we want to kind of just return maybe some text that says that you have no favorites, because that's likely the reason that there's nothing there. And for our colors, instead of watching this, we're going to be watching our favorite colors provider. That's really the only change we need to do, and we should be good. You'll notice for the provider, we're still going to be watching the color list provider, and you'll see why in a minute. And back on our home screen, we need a way to get to the screen, so let's just add a simple actions, icon button, and we'll go like this. We'll go icon, icons dot, let's use the favorite border, and we essentially want to push to a screen, so I'm just going to grab this code here and put it in the onPressed event, and instead of pushing to the detail screen though, we're going to be pushing to the favorite screen. Okay, save that. Now we should have this little heart up here, and if I click it, we go this. We have no favorites. Now watch, as soon as I favorite a few things, and we go to the screen, we actually see we have some favorites here. And because we're relying on the same provider, we can still get that same functionality, right? I can actually click this, and you'll see instantly it's gone because it's no longer a favorited item. And we're just relying on really this data here. Put that one in, go back here, we'll see it's there. So we have our state, you know, app-wide, you know, we're not passing anything through the screens. And everything's cool. And you know, something that I think is important to note from earlier is we could have easily just passed, the color object that we had over to here and not worried about having a provider for this. And in fact, the data would have been instant. But there's two good reasons why we don't want to do that in a Flutter app. One being sometimes the endpoint to retrieve data might have more information, like it's an expanded version of it. And we want to make sure we're hitting that to get all the data, because sometimes the list view just has the very top level stuff. You hit the detail endpoint, you get something more detailed. That's not the case with this endpoint, with this API service, but it is pretty common. Secondly, if we're dealing with especially deep linking or web, we need to make sure that each screen on its own, based on just a URL path, can get the data on itself. Because on web, if someone shares a link and you come directly to that link, you can't rely on the fact that the user came to this screen first and then clicked through. So it's just a good practice never to be passing data through your routes. Again, we're not using a proper routing system here. We're just using this material page route. But you'll notice all we ever pass through was something very simple, like a string of a hex code, which could easily be something in a URL path. So yeah, just want to point that out, that's the reason we have these two different providers here. And of course, I wanted to show that off. All right, the last tip I want to go over, this is kind of an advanced tip, but something that has come up for me in the past, is let's say you have something like a storage provider, something to manage local storage or various other examples, and essentially something that you want to have access to, but it has like an async setup ahead of time. If we were just to use like a FutureProvider, the problem is every time we want to access it, we have to kind of be doing that data.when, when it's actually there, handling it. It's really it'd be really nasty to work with. So let's just create something for this. Let's call it storage provider. We're not actually going to build a real storage provider here, but I just kind of want to show, how it could work. So let's have something that's going to, return, and I'm just going to do a string for this. This would maybe be the provider itself, and we'll just call it like initialize storage. And this is just a function. This isn't a provider. This is just the thing that's going to get us going. And what it might do is do something and sort of setup. So I'm just going to do a future.delayed of duration, milliseconds, 500. So that's just us mocking, like it's doing some async setup, and then it's going to return the client itself. And in this case, because we want to do a string, we're just going to return hello. So not a great example, but it just works for our purposes for sure. Then what we would need to do is let's create a provider called our initialization, storage init. We'll just call it storage init provider because I don't feel like writing initialization. And this will be a future provider. And of course, you could use a generator for this too, but I'm just showing a simple example. And here, this will be async, and this will return an await of our initialize storage function. Okay, then we'll actually make the storage provider itself. So our storage provider is going to be just a provider, kind of like when we were making that computer provider of our storage client. But again, in our example, it's just a string. And in here, we basically are going to go final client is going to be equal ref.watch our storage init provider. So we're going to watch the initialization provider dot as data, which could be null, dot value. Okay, and then here we just return that client. Return client. There we go. We seem to have some little issue here. Let's just see. This is it. String. Right. It could be null. So let's just do that. And we're fine. Okay. So now the secret sauce here in our main.dart is what we want to do is before we actually run the app, we're going to essentially await this from happening. So we'll have our await. Actually, we'll make it something. Well, we'll call it storage client is going to be equal to await. And here we use something called provider container. Okay, and what we can do is with our provider container, we can do read, and then we'll use our storage initialization or storage init provider dot future. So we're going to await for that. Now we do have to mark this as async because we are awaiting. Okay, so now we have this here. Then when we do our provider scope, instead of just passing in like normally, we can actually go and pass in some overrides. And right here, we would go storage provider which I don't think is what I, storage provider dot override with. It's telling me this, I don't know why, we just want override with. And here we actually pass in ref, and we get access to our storage client. And the reason we have this error is because we have a const wrapped here, so we'll actually put the const here instead. So we'll save that. And now within our app, we can safely use our storage client. Now, if something went wrong with the actual bootstrapping of this, our app would create a crazy error, so you'd want to make sure the storage client is resilient and everything like that. But we'd be able to now just do our ref.read storage client, storage provider throughout our app and work with it. It's already initialized, it's good to go. So that's just a fun bonus tip that I wasn't sure if I was going to include depending on time, but I think it was worth doing because there's not really any documentation on this that I could find. It was a lot of searching, Stack Overflows and GitHub issues and stuff of a good way to do this. But yeah, that's just something cool. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing and liking if you did. And looking forward to the next video. See you there.